We are talking to Mark in California.
Hey, V.
Mark, welcome back to the show. How are you?
Thanks. I'm well. I'm glad you're feeling better. I was calling on an entirely different track than the previous call.
Sounds good. Let's do it.
Okay. I come from a different sort of a background than many of the people that end up calling into the show because I was never religious. I was never a Christian.
Mm-hmm.
I was raised in a scientific household where we just didn't talk about religion. It didn't even occur to me that people were religious until middle school when I noticed that there were all these churches around.
Mm-hmm.
So my focus as an atheist has always been, okay, I'm an atheist, I'm a skeptic. Now what?
Right.
Now, what kind of world are we trying to build? And I see a lot of people in the atheist sphere kind of, because they've been wounded by their religious experience, kind of falling into the anti-theist hole and just staying there and beating against Christianity,
yeah,
or religion generally. And I just think that there's a bigger question to be asked about, what kind of a world would we build as skeptics and atheists if we were given the opportunity? What kind of values would we advance?
I think that's a good conversation, and it's multi-parted. There are many pieces to this.
Yeah.
First, I think that there is. I'm gonna get in so much trouble for saying this. There is an impetus to remaining in the angry atheist phase longer than you actually are in it. It's one of the reasons why we took this show in a different direction from the one we were on previously. It's one of the reasons why I have stopped kind of engaging with a lot of the personalities and shows that I have that brought me into the atheist movement. Because it is lucrative socially and sometimes financially to stoke the angry atheist phase. And the people who are just coming out of that religious environment, they are wounded, they are angry, they are looking for something to validate their experience, and validating their experience and hearing that anger is a valuable component of getting them out. So I don't want to belittle that or say that that's not something that should happen. But when that's all that you do, when you don't move beyond that and start asking questions, Mark, like what you are asking, what next? Okay, how do we build a moral system outside of that? All of that is so important to bring the conversation forward in any meaningful way. Because otherwise, what we end up with is a increasing majority, because atheists are increasing in the U.S., that are just now angry ex-Christians who are anti-theists and mad at everybody else. And that sets us up for a whole other kind of problem that's going to happen in 25, 50 years unless we start having these conversations right now.
Absolutely.
So that was my little caveat right there. But
okay.
What I think that we need to be doing is stopping the focus on religion entirely. And that could, again, maybe we lose some followers over this, I don't know, but there is something that is so... It feels to me, the more that I look at what's actually wrong with the world and what actually helps and hurts, religion has become a scapegoat and a tool that is used by people who value the division that religion causes. They value the fact that religion makes you docile. Religion can make you a follower, a sheep, and be proud of it. Call yourself a sheep proudly and follow what your pastor tells you. So all of a sudden, you don't need to worry about convincing 200 people. You just need to convince one person. And the 199 people who listen to that person is going to follow. So I think that focusing on religion and talking about it in terms of atheists and theists and that by itself needs to go. We can have those conversations, but when we're talking about building a new society or creating a culture that includes everybody, religion has to be just as incidental as like what job you have, right? Or what kind of car you drive. The second that we can deplatform it to the point where it can be just another character trait about a person is when we can actually make progress.
I really agree with that. In the communities that I'm building with around atheopaganism, we spend very little time talking about religion. We do have an affinity group for people who are recovering from religion, where they can talk about the hurt and the betrayal and we understand that to be a separate conversation from the conversation about, well, how do we build observances into our lives? What sorts of values do we, consider appropriate? Those sorts of things. And I hadn't actually really put together what you just said, the idea of dropping the conversation about religion entirely. But I think it's a good point, because as long as our fight is against something that is so intrinsic to people's identity, it's just going to be a really uphill slog. I think we need to wait for demographics to do this for us.
Yeah, and it's certainly not something.
I'm concerned.
Sorry, go ahead.
Well, I'm concerned too about what you talk about with a population of people who are really angry. We've seen in the last 6 years what happens when you have a population of people who are really angry. They can be awful. They can be really destructive, and we don't want to be those.
Exactly.
So we need to start having the conversation about who we do want to be.
Yeah, I fully agree with you. And another big component of that is going to be, like you said, demographics. It's going to be getting out of bubbles of the type of person that, because what happens is people leave a church because they stop believing. And then they go and find other people who have left similar churches, who have also stopped believing. And what that does is that creates another echo chamber of people who have left churches because they stopped believing, but in all other respects are still living out lives that are parallel to that church with, one big difference. They don't believe in God anymore. And what really stopped my path in that direction, thankfully, and opened up new doors for me, was listening to people who, like you, had never been religious, or people who were still Christian, but were looking at things from a much more progressive and leftist standpoint than I was as an atheist at the time. Or, people who had completely different religions or experiences with Christianity. A lot of people in the Black and BIPOC communities. And listening to indigenous religious spokespeople and like people who talk about indigenous religion and how that intersects with the things that I value as a secular humanist. All of those other perspectives, those other demographics that I was kind of opening myself up to, was the thing that stopped me from just being another angry atheist on the internet. And I think that moving forward, we are going to perpetuate the same exact abuses, the same exact problems as our Christian, past would have, if all we are doing is saying, well, now I don't believe in God anymore, so that makes me a better person, so now I get to decide what you do. That's never, ever going to be the answer.
Yeah. Well, I see that we, once again have a really shared perspective on this. I just think it's a really important conversation to continue to have because, there is so much work, and it's sort of interesting because when I think about the work of working with people that are deconstructing, that are coming out of Christianity or other authoritarian religions, the work that the word that I think of in relation to that is either pastoral or ministry, because it's this sort of healing, counseling kind of deal.
Yeah.
But that's only really, one sort of step on the way towards, well, how are you going to be a full person now? Right? You were in a discipline that told you not to be a full person, that told you to be obedient to an authority and take your instruction from someone else. Now, how are you going to step into the fullness of yourself? Because in my opinion, people are amazing. I think people have extraordinary beauty inside them, except for the most damaged of us. Some of whom are dangerous, and it's a shame, but some people get broken. But most people, given an opportunity to be loved and to see themselves clearly, will blossom. And I want to live in a society where that is an explicit goal, where the actual structure of the society is trying to foster that in people.
Yeah. I mean, honestly, again, we need to move outside of the realm of religion, though, because religion, in the context of what you're saying, is a tool to keep people from expressing themselves fully and being themselves fully. But the goal is not ultimately just to make people religious, right? That might be individuals' goals, right? Like your street preacher isn't thinking about the broader implications of a community that all adheres to the same moral fabric, but that is ultimately what we're talking about. A culture, a society that fully embraces all types of people is one that makes that removes the requirement to work certain types of jobs in order to make a living wage, right? It pretty much eradicates the concept of wages altogether in its current context. It is a socialist welfare state at its minimum. And that is where the conversation always turns. If we talk to Christians who we see as being oppressive in these areas, and we start saying, okay, well, what if you could keep your faith? What if we could say that, like, you were right, but let's talk about, a more progressive form of that doesn't infringe on your beliefs in God, but maybe helps out your neighbor a little bit more. A lot of them are going to say no, because it's not about the faith. It has been so deeply tied into politics that at this point, opposing somebody's political stance is opposing their religion and vice versa. So what we need to do, like I said, is completely I think we need to stop talking about the religious component and start talking about it from the political standpoint, because without that, we're never going to get to that utopia, Mark, that you described, which I agree with. So, yeah.
Yeah, I agree with all of that. And I guess my feeling is that one of the things that I'm frustrated about is that because there are so many atheists now, and so many of the so-called nones, people that are identify with no religion, we should be a much more potent political force now than we are.
Right.
And we aren't. I mean, I'm fortunate that my congressman is Jared Huffman, who founded the Secular Caucus in the House of Representatives. But he was the first member of the House of Representatives ever to describe himself as a non-believer.
Yeah.
And we're a long way behind. The Christian right, in terms of the active members of the Christian right, it's only about 20% of the country, but they swing so much weight. And
well, they also have.
We ought to be able to do that too.
Yeah, I think that honestly, I agree that the sheer demographic size of people who are not Christian in the United States should be a much bigger political force, whether or not we're talking, Democrat, Republican, third party, whatever. That should be a demographic that is actually talked to directly. This is why, voting for me would benefit this group specifically. And it's not. And we know the reasons for that. The other thing I do want to just say beforehand, though, is that, the reason that there is so much weight behind a very small group of people right now is because they have money.
Yeah.
So like they've got a lot of monetary and social liquidity that the atheists in this country simply do not. And so there's definitely that element as well. So it's not necessarily a moral failing on the part of that specific demographic so much as it is the deck has been stacked against us and continues to be. And it's just by sheer numbers at this point that we are starting to see change. And that is what is freaking out the people who are on the other side of this, and causing them to bear down as hard as they are. Because even with the money, even with the establishment of entire foundations and research centers and think tanks and colleges dedicated specifically to getting them into power, they are still losing their grip on that monopoly, and that is freaking them out. So the more we have these conversations, Mark, the faster we're going to get to some semblance of a world that actually treats us all like equals.
Yeah, I agree. Certainly when you have the Koch brothers and the Waltons and all the, it makes things a lot easier when you have billions of dollars pouring into your coffers. And I think there's a cultural thing too. I mean, one of the things about skepticism is that people tend to think for themselves, right? Whereas capitalism doesn't want you to think for yourself. It wants you to be a good little cog in the wheel and make money and then donate it to conservative causes. So there's that factor too.
Yeah, it's a movement centered around don't tell me what to do, which makes it very difficult to organize, makes it very difficult to come together on anything. So there is certainly that element as well. But we at least need to keep talking about it and shedding light on it. So thank you for calling in, Mark. I appreciate you.
Oh, sure. It's always a pleasure to talk with you, V. Thanks. I'm glad you're feeling better.
Thank you. Have a good rest of your day.
You too. Bye-bye.
Bye.